Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction and especially for inviting me. Thank you very much to Professor Sperber and Dr. Boas. I'm really grateful for being able to be here among you. The presentation of Professor Bacon was a wonderful basis, much more broader than what I will be talking about. I will take only a very small part of it. That's it, historiography on Jews in Czechoslovakia and Poland after the war. And not only this limitation, but also I focus especially on works which deal with Polish and Czech Jews who were part of the Czechoslovak or Polish states after the war. And some of my talk is actually very closely connected to what Professor Bacon just spoke about. So I would like to start with a very similar claim. Since the emancipation period, historians have been asking questions about the advantages and disadvantages of the Jewish minority's process of adaptation to the majority European societies. The resulting conclusions and judgments depend largely on the ideological background of each author. The Zionist interpretation, which conceives Jews as a distinct nation, usually depicts the adaptation process as a futile search for acceptance. In contrast, the integrationists praise Jewish achievements within the local majority nations and instead interpret adaptation as a process of overcoming ghetto life. Now, this dichotomy in judging the process of adaptation is still very dominant in interpretations of post-Shoah history. The struggle for the Jewish state reached its climax after the Second World War and was logically accompanied by heavy and often aggressive Zionist propaganda against the European diaspora. And the same is true of some of the Jewish communists in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, who hoped for a just society under communism and especially after 1950 depicted Zionism as an imperialist movement. I would argue, however, that there is a big divergence between the two models of interpretation. Zionist historiography was in the meantime heavily criticized and underwent a dramatic development. Even though we still find one-sided pro-Zionist interpretations of post-war developments, which is understandable in the context of the continuing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one cannot overlook, and this was also clearly shown in Professor Bacon's speech, the many different approaches and suggestions for more balanced interpretations. In contrast to this, I would argue that the historiography on the Jews of the former communist states generally continues to stick to the master narratives of local national history and to some extent also to the socialist premises, and that this narrative surprisingly survived the collapse of the communist regimes. So what was the nature of this nationalist and socialist approach to Central and Eastern European history during the communist times? Regarding Jewish history, we have two trends in the general historiography. Jews were either marginalized or totally neglected. If historians, often Jews themselves, wanted to write about the Jews in their country, they had to apply the national and socialist model to Jewish history as well. In most of these works, Jews are depicted as loyal citizens, patriots of the majority nations, and also often as people who already had a lukewarm attitude to religion, seeing religion as something backward, ghetto-like. And so I would like to argue that even if the political pressure to write about Jews in this way has ceased to exist, modern Jewish historiography written in the countries of the Central and Eastern Europe, but surprisingly also often that written by historians in the West, is still dominated by the focus on the assimilated Jews. And I aim to demonstrate this particularly by analyzing briefly the historiography of the Jews in post-war Poland and Czechoslovakia. Before I start, I should mention that there is an enormous discrepancy between the Polish and Czech historiography on post-war Jewish history. If in Polish case, the number of historians who deal with post-war Jewish history goes into dozens in Poland only, in the Czech case, we have only individuals, even if we count all around the world. Most research about Czechoslovakia is focused on the relationship between the state and the Jews. The only book that focuses on the local Jews is by Alena Heitlinger, professor of sociology at Trent University, Canada. It was published in 2006 as In the Shadows of the Holocaust and Communism, Czech and Slovak Jews since 1945. Her research is based on an analysis of more than 200 questionnaires filled in by Czech and Slovak Jews born between 1940 and 1960. They were replying to questions she sent to them at the beginning of the 21st century. Up to a point, it is reasonable to compare her project with that of the Polish sociologist Irena Hurwitz-Nowakowska, who asked surprisingly similar questions.
Is she also a sociologist? Heitlinger?
Yeah.
She's not a historian?
No. But no historian until now really wrote about the Jews in Czechoslovakia. It's always the relationship of state towards Jews. Okay, so both Heitlinger and Hurwitz-Nowakowska were interested primarily in the identity of those people and therefore in questions of nationality, religion, language, and experiences of anti-Semitism. The major difference is that Hurwitz-Nowakowska conducted her research immediately after the war. Heitlinger half a century later among the second generation, and most of their answers were based on memories from childhood. So back to Heitlinger. Her book is important for anyone studying Czechoslovak post-war Jewish history. It can, however, also serve as a good example of a typical perspective taken in research of the Jews in the Bohemian lands in the 20th century. Of her interviewees, 119 identified themselves as Czech Jews, the others as Slovak Jews. And most of those Czech Jews were part of a network that had been established in the 1960s when the leadership of the Prague Jewish community started to organize lecture series about Jewish culture, religion, and history. And for many of those young people, this was the first opportunity to meet other Jews, to discuss their often only recently discovered Jewishness. They call themselves the children of Majzlovka. They meet since the 90s, they meet every year. And they call themselves children of Majzlovka after the name of the Prague street where they met in the Jewish town hall. And in her book, Heinrich, who was part of the group, concludes that most of the post-war Czech Jews were secular, deeply rooted in the Czech language and traditions, had mostly become aware of their Jewish identity only because other people identified them as Jews, and that they had mostly perceived their being Jewish in a communist society as a stigma. Though this fits well into the self-image of the Czech Jewish community, and the book was very well received, this picture is distorted. And I would like to argue that we come to totally different conclusions if we focus not solely on Prague, but also look at the periphery, the border regions. The shifting state borders and national cleansing has been a popular topic in historiography in recent years. It seems to me, however, that we still underestimate the impact that those changes and forced migration had on post-war society. Historians who stick to the master narrative of national history are always more focused on the continuity of settlement and tend to suppress the huge impact of migration. Nearly half of the post-war Jews in the Bohemian lands were migrants who had lived mostly in Subcarpathian Ruthenia or eastern Slovakia before the war and had come to the Bohemian lands because the Soviet Union had annexed Subcarpathian Ruthenia in 1945, and also because of anti-Semitism. And most of those Jews decided to settle in the northern and western Bohemian border regions from where the German-speaking population had just been expelled and where there were many job opportunities and vacant flats. And similarly, Polish Jews who had ended up in Soviet Union because they were deported there, because they escaped there, or because of the Soviet annexation of eastern Poland after the war, were after the war sent in repatriation trains primarily to Lower Silesia, which had just been annexed to Poland and from where the local German population had been also expelled. Jewish settlement in the border regions in both countries was not therefore marginal at all. For Poland, we have a wonderful map for this. You see that in spring 1947, so already after the mass migration, after the pogrom in Kielce, still nearly half of all Jews in Poland lived in Lower Silesia. Unfortunately, we don't have such a nice map for Bohemian lands, but still, we can say that after Prague, most of the major Jewish communities in Bohemia were in the region which was called Sudetenland by the Nazis. And 90% of members of those old new Jewish communities were Jews from Subcarpathian Ruthenia, and who shaped these new Jewish communities by introducing traditions very different from those of the pre-war period. In a report from mid-1946, Israel Jakobson, the head of the Joint Distribution Committee in Czechoslovakia, wrote, I quote, "The Council of Jewish Communities in Bohemia and Moravia Silesia has been trying to arrange for every community with a substantial number of Jews, especially where there now reside Jews from Slovakia and Subcarpathia, to have the services of a shochet. The communities received Megillot for Purim and Haggadot and Machzorim for Passover. A few talaisim were also supplied, but the demand of talaisim, tfilim, mezuzot, tzitzot could not be met because of the unavailability of these articles in Czechoslovakia. The council aided the various Jewish communities in installing mikvot, covering both capital costs and current expenses. It is hoped that by the end of this year, mikvot will be established throughout the Czech lands, wherever Jews from Eastern countries now reside and wish to observe Taharat Nashim. End of the quote. So as this report reveals, the JDC helped, through the good offices of the Council of the Jewish Communities, to build up a post-war infrastructure for the practice of the Jewish religion, which had been nearly totally absent in Bohemia since the second half of the 19th century. From the interviews with members of those communities, one gets a totally different picture of the post-war Jewish experience in Bohemia than the one Alena Heitlinger offers. Most of those families kept kosher. Some children had Yiddish names in the privacy of their homes and Czech names for outside. And there was a strong sense of Jewish solidarity and of belonging to a precious tradition and community, so no stigma. At the same time, those Jews also had very close friends among their non-Jewish neighbors. They were often appreciated in the workplace, and their children were happy members of the communist organizations for children and youth. This story of people from the periphery who knew Yiddish and Hungarian better than they knew Czech. This I can demonstrate by a sketch of the balcony plating from the 1960s of a Jewish tinsmith from Děčín. That's him, that's the wedding photo. So they knew Yiddish and Hungarian better. They were religious. They were mostly craftsmen or manual workers. But this is still not accepted as an integral part. Their story is not accepted as into the integral part of the Czech Jewish post-war history. And this is odd, as is demonstrated also if you look at the map of today's 10 Jewish communities in the Czech Republic. 5 of them are in the former Sudetenland and have survived only thanks to Jews from Carpathian Ruthenia. Now, concerning Poland, we are lucky to have much more research on post-war Polish Jews, including some of the micro-studies which we lack totally in case of Czechoslovakia. But still, I think there is a very similar dominant focus in the historiography on the assimilated Jews. So if we mention Marci Schur's Caviar of Ashes and Ashes, Warsaw Generations, Life and Death in Marxism, or my very favorite book, which was already mentioned, of Karen Auerbach, The House of Ujazdowskie 16. These very important books, and many others, also written in Polish, strengthen the image of the post-war Polish Jews as being very pro-communist, anti-religious, and well integrated into Polish intellectual society. And this is true of many, but not all. I have mentioned that Irena Hurwitz-Nowakowska conducted sociological research similar to Alena Heitlinger. So this is her book. Hers, however, is much more relevant than Heitlinger's for many reasons. First, this is because of the scope of her research. Whereas Heitlinger had more than 200 respondents, Hurwitz-Nowakowska received answers from more than 800 people. And as we have seen, she did her research in post-war years, and so her answers, the answers are related to the present experience. And third, Hurwitz-Nowakowska has chosen 3 cities: Warsaw, Łódź, and Dzierżoniów in Lower Silesia. This enabled her to show the huge discrepancy between the 3 localities. Even if she is not particularly interested in those differences and tends to speak only about like generous trends among the Polish Jews, her book offers clear evidence that the situations in Warsaw and in Lower Silesia differed enormously. First, in language, most Jews in Warsaw spoke Polish, and those who knew Yiddish claimed in the answers that they often have no opportunity to speak Yiddish. In contrast to that, in Łódź and especially in Dzierżoniów, people were speaking Yiddish on the street as well as at home. Regarding education, it's very similar to the case of Czechoslovakia. 40% of all respondents from Warsaw had university education, which was true only of 4% in Lower Silesia. And the last major difference which I want to mention has to do with religion. In contrast to Warsaw, Dzierżoniów had a very important Orthodox Jewish community in addition to the pro-socialist Jews. Hurwitz-Nowakowska recalls meeting women with wigs, celebrating Shabbat in a traditional way, which was obviously something totally new for her, even though she has many quotations from Dzierżoniów, and also to some extent from Łódź, about the importance of religion to the lives of the Jews. She, who was member of the socialist movement already in the interwar period, reveals her prejudices in her otherwise rigorously academic work. She claims that the religious Jews have a ghetto stance, postwar, and she's sure that there will be soon no such Jews anymore. And this is again quite typical for this dominant narrative about the Jews, and this tone of disdain for the Orthodox Jews. And it's interesting that it also appears in a recent Czech publication, which was in English published only last year in Yad Vashem, or it was translated by Yad Vashem colleagues or published by Yad Vashem. In this publication of more than 1,000 pages, which aspires to become the authoritative work on the subject, August Grabski and Albert Stankowski, in their article about Jewish religious life in post-war Poland, skip those parts of from Hurwitz-Nowakowska where she describes meeting Orthodox Jews and goes to the quotes she made. So they quote in full the very problematic sentences about the ghetto style of the Orthodox Jews, and they described Orthodox Jews as the last Mohicans. Even though they mention that according to the answers of which Hurwitz-Nowakowska got, 56 respondents claimed that they are non-religious, but still it means 44% were for some meaning of religion in their lives. So it seems to me that the writing on Jewish history in the post-war period in Central and Eastern Europe follows very similar pattern as the historiography on German Jews in the 19th century. The assimilationist model for the German Jewish history has, however, been highly criticized already. Can mention David Sorkin's Transformation of German Jewry, or several crucial works of Tobias Brinkmann, Anne-Christine Saas, and others who have shown the impact of migrants on the German pre-Shoah society. And I would like to argue that we should learn from these discussions about the German Jewish history for the post-war. Maybe it's because of the lack of distance that we still stick in the ideological rhetoric. And I would also like to argue that a way to avoid this simplistic perspective is to focus on the Jews of the border regions, the periphery, because, as I have shown, those are very significant Jewish communities. And let me conclude with a sentence that, even though I think this focus on the periphery could be the first step, I think the next step should be, and it was already mentioned also by Professor Bacon, that we also should overcome this majority-minority model of society as such. Thank you for your attention.